Live and Let Live Part 2, a psychological thriller by VMS. The most dangerous betrayals are not always between spouses. Sometimes the deepest betrayal is abandoning yourself for people who only loved your function. Love, when it arrives at 50, does not come alone. It comes escorted by a wreckage, not always visible wreckage, not broken furniture or public scandal or dramatic accusations hurled across dinner tables. No, its destruction is subtler, more psychologically merciless. It threatens systems and family structure, social mythology, inherited obedience, and the carefully preserved illusion that sacrifice, if prolonged enough, eventually becomes love. For Meera and Rajiv, the months following their first meeting were not defined by romance, and they were defined by a reckoning, because once the two people have looked into the face of their unlived truth, returning quietly to emotional exile becomes its own form of violence. And yet, truth, however liberating, it never convenient, and not when children exist, not when marriages, however hollow, still perform respectability, not when society forgives lawlessness more easily than it forgives a late happiness. At first, the changes were nearly imperceptible, a softness in Mira's eyes where numbness once lived, a private smile she no longer explained, an absence of automatic compliance. For 28 years, her husband Suresh mistaken Mira's emotional endurance for permanence, and he has not been cruel in the cinematic sense. Cruelty, Mira had learned, was often quieter, and it was being taken for granted so consistently that your humanity became background noise. And Suresh respected Mira, valued her efficiency, depended on her management of domestic order, but cherished her. No, he had long ago grown comfortable receiving from her that he had never meaningfully learned to reciprocate. And so when Mira began changing, not rebelliously, not but inwardly, he noticed. Not because he suddenly saw her, but because he sensed diminished control. Why are you smiling at your phone? The question came casually one evening, but casualness, Mira knew, can often be violence wearing polite clothes. She looked up because something I read made me happy. It was true, but truth, selectively delivered, can sound like deceit to those accustomed only to access. Suspicion entered then, not with certainty but with masculine discomfort. Suresh did not initially fear another man. He feared emotional displacement because for the first time Mira's interiority no longer belonged entirely to the ecosystem of his assumptions. Rajiv's home shifted differently. His wife Kavita was less observant emotionally but exquisitely sensitive socially. She noticed changes not in Rajiv's sorrow but in his absence from performative rituals. He no longer argued over superficialities, no longer defined prestige for its own sake, no longer seemed invested in maintaining appearances as a substitute for fulfillment. At family dinners, he was present but psychologically elsewhere, not detached, awakened, and awakening in families built more on structure than intimacy can appear threatening. You have changed, Kavita said one night, not accusingly but with irritation, sharpened by insecurity. Rajiv almost laughed, not cruelly but with private irony. Changed? No, he had not changed, he had remembered. Their daily messages intensified, not in sentimentality but strategic urgency. For the first time in years, Meera and Rajiv conversation were no longer solely about longing, they became more about architecture. What now? Every morning brought new developments, and Meera, he checks my phones with his eyes now, even if not his hands. And Rajiv replied, Kavita asked today whether I'm happy. I almost told her unhappiness implies expectation. They analyzed everything, not impulsively, not selfishly, but like two psychologically seasoned adults confronting the moral mathematics of liberation. Would leaving destroy their children? Unlikely. Their children were grown, not fragile dependents, but adults already constructing private lives, romantic entanglements, career ambitions. They loved the appearance, yes, but love, Meera realized painfully, did not always equal understanding. For years, she had been emotional infrastructure, Rajiv had been financial architecture, and they were needed, and but were they known, and beneath that, would they really actually be missed or merely resisted? This question haunted them both, not because they doubted their worth, because they feared confusing utility with love. Mira began noticing painful patterns with devastating clarity, and when she was exhausted, her absence was inconvenient. When she was efficient, she was praised. When she was emotionally quiet, no one asked why. When she provided, she was indispensable. But when had anyone truly asked, "What do you want now?" Raja's revelations were equally brutal. His family valued him immensely as provider, decision maker, and status bearer. His sacrifices had purchased comfort so effectively that his emotional deprivation had become irrelevant, and he was respected, but respect absent tenderness had become a glided cage. Their conversations turned darker, more honest, and they were nights that fantasized not foolishly, not desperately, about leaving everything immediately. A small home, a quiet city, books, morning tea, late honesty, no performance, no pretending. A second life, but neither wanted destruction. This mattered, and they were not vindictive, not irresponsible. They did not wish to own their families, only to stop wounding themselves. And so they debated endlessly. Would staying preserve peace or merely preserve image? Would leaving devastate their families or simply inconvenience systems built around their silent compliance? Then came the mirrors, their children unexpectedly, painfully, powerfully. Mira's daughter Ananya noticed first, "Ma, are you happy?" Such a simple question, and it Mira nearly broke because children once grown sometimes stop seeing parents as institutions and begin seeing them as people. For perhaps the first time, Mira did not offer maternal diplomacy. "I don't know, Ananya," she said. Ananya's response altered everything. "Then maybe that matters more than pretending it does." And Rajiv's son Arjun was less verbal but equally perceptive. One evening, after observing his father's unusual introspection, he asked quietly, "You gave us everything, Dad, but I don't think any of us ever asked what it cost you." Rajiv could not speak for several minutes because in that moment his son ceased being judge. He became witness, and not all responses were compassionate. Their spouses objected fiercely when truth began surfacing. Not because love had suddenly awakened, but because disruption threatened the status. And how would society perceive? What about reputation, property, and extended family? Prestige panic before intimacy ever did. Mira understood then with a devastating finality. She had not been married inside a love story, and she had been functioning inside an institution. Rajiv reached similar clarity. For years, he had preserved a structure whose emotional bankruptcy had been disguised by financial success. So they made lists, literally, with the pros and cons, and not because love was uncertain, because consequences deserved. The pros of leaving their family, emotional truth, dignity, and second chance, an authentic life, and freedom from performative marriages and honest companionship, selfhood restored. The cons of leaving their family, social condemnation, familial backlash, temporary pain, reputation damage, and the financial restructuring. And when all analysis ended, one truth remained unavoidable. Their families might object, but objection was not the same as devastation. People resist change most fiercely when it threatens comfort, not always when it threatens love. And Mira and Raju had spent too many years confusing their families' dependence on their roles with reverence for their souls. So finally, after months of fear, guilt, therapy like discussions, moral dissections, and nights of trembling honesty, they chose. Not recklessly, not selfishly, but consciously, they would leave, not their children, not responsibility. And they would leave emotional death, and they would stop performing marriages whose primary currencies were status, money, and pride, and they would choose, perhaps for the first time in their lives, themselves. When Meera sent Rajiv the final message that sealed it, her hands trembled, but not from uncertainty, only from the enormity of courage. I have given my life to everyone who needed me for once. I want to give that. What remains to the woman I abandoned? And if she chooses you, then let the choice be made without shame. Raja's reply came immediately. Then live, Meera, not quietly, not apologetically. Live as though your soul was never meant to die inside duty. And so, after 50, not in rebellion, not in scandal, but in profound psychological resurrection, Meera and Rajiv chose love. Not the naive love for first beginnings, but the fierce, dignified, terrifying love of second chances. The kind of love that does not ask, and what will people think, but instead, how much of my one life am I willing to lose pretending? The next chapter, Live and Let Live, they did not burn their old lives down. They simply refused to keep dying inside them. There are departures born of age, doors slammed, accusations flung like knives, and years reduced to ash in one particular act of rebellion. But Meera and Rajiv, after all they had endured, understood something profound. Destruction was easy, redefinition required courage. And they were not children fleeing punishment, not reckless lovers intoxicated by scandal, not fugitives for morality from morality. And they were two educated, emotionally withered human beings who had finally learned the difference between sacrifice and self erasure. And so, when they chose each other publicly, not with vulgarity but with devastating clarity, they did not set out to destroy families. They set out to stop destroying themselves. Their final act within their former homes was not war, it was truth, diplomatic, measured, unflinching, and they wrote letters not because they lacked courage to speak, but because certain truths observe or deserve the precision that only written language can preserve. For weeks, they drafted and redrafted each word, carrying the moral burden of decades, and they refused blame. This mattered deeply. Neither Meera nor Rajiv wished to rewrite history into villainy. Their spouses had not necessarily been monsters, and they had simply been incompatible custodians of deeper needs. And there is tragedy in that, but not always malice. So the letters did not accuse, they clarified. Meera's letter, I am leaving not because I was unloved in visible ways, but because I have lived too long without being truly known. I have fulfilled every duty asked of me with the dignity, loyalty, and love. But duty without selfhood is slow extinction. This is not abandonment, this is reclamation. I will always remain a mother, I will always care, I will continue to support where support is needed, but I can no longer teach my children sacrifice while betraying my own soul. For the years ahead, I chose honesty over performance, and people do not remember this as betrayal, remember it as a first truthful act of my life. And Rajiv's letter, I have spent decades building stability, security, and respect. I do not regret that, but somewhere along the way, I became more valuable for what I provided than for who I was. I live not in bitterness but in awakening. I will honor every responsibility that remains mine, financially, ethically, and humanly. But I cannot continue living a life where image thrives while spirit starves. I deserve even now to know what it means to live as a whole man. They surrendered almost everything, properties, assets, prestige, symbols, architecture of appearances, not because they were defeated but because they were free. They left a little more than education, experience, young wisdom, and each other's hands, and astonishingly, it felt like abundance. There is a peculiar liberation that comes one stops mistaking wealth for worth, and for the first time in their adult lives, Meera and Rajiv stepped into uncertainty not as loss but as authorship. No grand wedding, no public declarations, no performative revenge, but a modest home in a quiet city chosen not for status but serenity. A place with sunlight in the mornings, bookshelves, two desks, kitchen large enough for shady and unhurried conversations, a balcony where evenings could finally belong to presence instead of pretense. And this is their first night. There was not defined by passion, it was defined by peace. Mira stood by the window watching rain silver the streets below, and Rajiv came behind her, not possessively, not hungrily, but reverently. His arms around her felt like conquest and more like arrival. For several months, neither spoke. Then Mira's voice trembling with the enormity of for several moments that neither spoke, and then Mira's voice trembling with the enormity of beginning again whispered, "We really left." Rajiv rested his forehead gently against her temple. "No, Mira," he said softly, "we finally arrived." Their intimacy, when it blossomed fully, was unlike youthful urgency, and it was not driven by insecurity or conquest. It was profoundly educated by deprivation. Every gesture between them carried the tenderness of people who knew precisely what it meant to go without. When Rajiv brushed Mira's hair at night, it was not routine, it was restoration. When Mira placed her head in Rajiv's lap after difficult days, it was not dependency, it was sanctuary. They did not merely love each other, they cared for each other's exhaustion, and this perhaps because became their greatest romance. Rajiv learned the invisible signs of Mira's overthinking, the way she folded silence inward, the way her shoulders tightened when old guilt resurfaced, and Mira learned Rajiv's storms too. The subtle withdrawal when he felt burdened, the lifelong masculine instinct to solve pain before admitting it. So they made a pact: no martyrdom, no emotional abandonment, no silent suffering in the name of strength. And if one cared too much, the other noticed, and if one broke, the other held. Work returned to not as survival, as expansion. Mira rebuilt her psychological practice with astonishing success, specializing in emotional rehabilitation, women's identity after sacrifice, and second life transactions. And Rajiv, with his strategic brilliance, launched consultancy ventures and later co-founded social platforms focused on reinvention after 50. Together, they became not scandal but symbol, not of selfishness but of courage, redesign, a wealth, and interestingly return not inherited prestige, yon prosperity, immense eventuality, and yet neither clung to it. They continued supporting their children, funding dreams, offering assistance, not from guilt but by generosity, because living old lives had never meant abandoning love. It had simply meant refusing exploitation. Their children over time understood, some sooner than others, what began as shock matured into respect. For perhaps the greatest inheritance Mira and Raji gave them was not money but example. The example that adulthood need not become self burial, the dignity, the desire can coexist, that love even late can be ethical. And then came the strangest, most sacred realization of all. Throughout their new life together, both carried the haunting sense that this love was not new, it was remembered in shade silences that felt centuries old, in familiar gestures never thought, in dreams where they seemed to walk through unnamed eras, and searched for each other in the inexplicable grief of having found one another late. Sometimes Mira would look at Rajiv across breakfast, light and feel, and with breathtaking certainty, "I have loved you before, not metaphorically, soulfully, as though lifetimes had once conspired against timing, and karma, patient at last, had returned with the what history delayed." Rajiv felt it too, especially in quiet moments, her sleeping beside him, her laughter in another room, her hand instinctively finding his in crowds. And this was not possession, this was continuity. Years passed, but unlike their first lives, these years were not endured, and they were inhabited. Morning walks became philosophical pilgrimages, cooking became foreplay for companionship, financial planning became partnership, aging became less frightening because neither was doing it unseen. And at At night, often Meera would rest in Rajiv's lap, his fingers moving through her silver threaded hair, and think, so this what peace feels like when it earned, not perfection, not fantasy, but peace. And Rajiv, looking down at the woman who had resurrected his unlived self, would silently thank every sorrow that had not destroyed them before they found each other. They had not escaped life, they had not redefined, they chose honesty over deception, selfhood over martyrdom, family without self erasure, and love without ownership, and freedom without cruelty. And in doing so, they became something rare, a proof that second chances are not consolation prizes, that love after 50 is not lesser because it arrives later, and that sometimes the truest life begins only after one has this courage to leave the first one. For Meera and Rajiv, Live and Let Live was never merely a title, it was philosophy, a vow, a karmic completion to live fully, to let others choose, to love without apology, and to never again depart. Not because life guaranteed forever, but because soul, once truly recognized, does not forget its own way home. The next chapter, the second life, the revolution of the unlived. They had saved each other, not they set out to save those. Now they set out to save those who had forgotten. They too deserved saving. The first office of Second Life Transitions was not impressive. No towering glass buildings, no polished marble lobby, no performance grandeur designed to intimidate vulnerability. It occupied in the third floor of a restored colonial era structure overlooking rain trees and an old public park where retired men often sat for hours pretending they were merely passing time. And women walked in pairs discussing grandchildren while quietly mourning unnamed absences. Irony was not lost on Mira. So many lives nearing conclusion, yet so few had ever truly begun. The office had sunlight, bookshelves, warm wooden floors, soft chairs deliberately chosen not for aesthetic but emotional safety, no desk between counsel and client, no symbols of hierarchy, no invitation. Above the entrance, etched in elegant brass, were the words that had become more than philosophy. Live and let live, emotional rehabilitation, reinvention after 50, second life restoration beneath it smaller. It is never too late to become the person grief postponed. The idea had begun quietly. One late afternoon evening, Meera sat cross-legged on the balcony floor, reviewing case notes from women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, wives, widows, divorcees, caregivers. Each story disturbing, similar despite different names. I'm invisible. I don't know who I am anymore. And my children need me less. My husband never needed me emotionally. Is it selfish to want more now? I think my life ended while I was still alive. Raji watched her in silence, not the silence of distance, the silence of recognition before revelation. Finally, he said, Meera, she looked up. What if we are not an exception? She frowned. What do you mean, Rajiv? Rajiv leaned forward, his voice carrying the dangerous electrifying of purpose. What if there are millions like us, people over 50 who did everything right and still feel unfinished? The rain outside intensified and something equally powerful ignited within them both. Not ambition, it's a mission. The second life transitions was born not as a business but movement, a global emotional rehabilitation platform for people for over 50 and navigating identity laws and who are navigating identity laws and empathy nest transitions and loveless marriages, widowhood, reinvention after retirement, emotional neglect, late life companionship, rediscovery of purpose. Together, Mero's psychological brilliance and Raj's strategic mastery became alchemy. They built a soul, he built a structure, and she built a soul. And their first public seminar was expected to attract perhaps 50 people. 3,000 registered in 48 hours. Within months, their podcasts went viral. Their articles were translated globally. Their online forums exploded with their testimonies and their retreats so loud. Their second chance dialogues became cultural phenomena. People came out merely for therapy. They came for permission and permission to grieve unlived years, permission to desire more, permission to love again, permission to matter beyond utility. The latest poured in thousands and from across continents. A 61-year-old widow from Jaipur, I thought loneliness was my punishment. You taught me it was my signal. A retired banker for Toronto for 35 years I provided. I never once asked what I wanted. Yesterday I enrolled in music school. A 58-year-old homemaker from Chennai. I have cooked for everyone except myself. Next month I travel alone for the first time. And perhaps most heartbreakingly, a 70-year-old man. Wife died 10 years ago, a decade. I loved her, but we were strangers. In 70, too late to meet someone I can finally talk to. Mira cried reading that one. Rajiv found her late, silent tears on her cheeks, and some griefs she whispered is not about losing love but never having had it. Rajiv knelt before Mira, taking her hands. Then we keep going, Mira, but revolutions, especially those threatening social obedience, are never welcomed without resistance. The backlash came swiftly, and media attacks started to destroying traditional family values, the dangerous romance of reinvention after 50, midlife rebellion disguised as therapy, or Mira and Rajiv encouraging emotional divorce among elders. And the next chapter, trial by fire, when society put love on trial. Every revolution that frees the silenced will first be accused of destroying the cage. Success, Mira would later say, did not arrive the day Aram Nestle expanded globally. It arrived the day down power structures became afraid, and because until then they had been dismissed as anomaly, a mature love story, an unusual reinvention, a philanthropic curiosity. But when millions began listening, when older women started questioning structural imprisonment, when retirement became confronting emotional starvation, when widows chose dignity over silent decay, and when grown up parents realized they could love their children without surrendering themselves entirely, society did what frightened institutions have always done. It attacked, not always with truth, but with narrative, and narrative weaponized skillfully enough can become more dangerous than accusation. For months, media houses had once celebrated Meera and Rajiv's inspiring journey, began sensing more profitable than admiration. Controversy, their love story became ideological battlefield, their movement became cultural threat, their philosophy became headline warfare. Primetime anchors sharpened language like blades, not because they misunderstood, because fear sold better than the new ants. And the next chapter, it is about destroying traditional family values. When obedience is mistaken for love, freedom will always appear dangerous. The first attack was strategic, framed them not as healers but destroyers. One nationality syndicated television panel opened with a dramatic music and archival footage of Meera leaving her marriage, Aram Nestle campuses, elderly residents dancing, and women traveling solo. The anchor voice sharpened for maximum moral panic asked, Amira Raman and Rajiv Dev liberating the elderly or systematically dismantling Indian family structure? The visual language was deliberate, not smiling elders rebuilding life, but crying adult children, selective divorce statistics, abundant parent imagery, a false equivalence emerged. Selfhood equal to selfless, freedom equal to family betrayal, and reinvention equal to cultural collapse. The next is about the narrative scenario. A manufactured victim's son, a popular network featured Aravind, 42, son of an Aram Nazal resident. My mother used to live with us, he said emotionally. Now she says she needs space. She moved to Jaipur, and this movement took her away. What the segment omitted, his mother, Kamala, had spent 20 years raising children while her own desires were mocked. When independent journalists later intervened Kamala, she calmly stated, my son did not lose a mother, he lost unpaid labor. The clip went viral and suddenly the debate shifted. Meera's public response was devastatingly precise. If family values depend upon one member's erasure, then perhaps what we are destroying is not family but sanctioned emotional servitude. And the next moment, the dangerous romance of reinvention after after 50. Nothing terrifies the social conditioning more than the idea that desire can survive duty. This accusation struck deeper because it targeted not policy but passion. For centuries, mature people, especially women, had been permitted to sacrifice wisdom, caregiving, but desire romantic hunger, erotic rebirth, companionship beyond prescribed marriages. That was dangerous. Media sensationalists, Aurum Nestle's and Soul Companion Forum as late life dating dens. I repeat, media sensationalized Aurum Nestle's Soul Companion Forum as late life dating dens. Headlines screamed silver scandal, grandparents gone wild, second chance, or social sin. Their love itself was scrutinized, and journalists revisited Meera and Rajiv's social media origin story with the insinuation: was this emotional infidelity masquerading as a destiny? Can online intimacy after marriage ever be ethical? What message does this send younger generation? Next is about the scenario public character assassination. A tabloid published side by side images. Meera was wife and mother in old family portraits versus Meera laughing beside Rajiv at an Aram Nestle event. Caption: from sacred vows to selfish freedom. The cruelty was breathtaking. It reduced her psychological evolution to scandalous optics. Rajiv too was painted as predatory and midlife seducer, corporate strategist exploiting vulnerable women. Despite decades of transparent work, public patriarchy used as ancient tactic. When a woman chooses herself, suspect corruption. When a man suspects her freedom, suspect manipulation. Rajiv's televised rebuttal became historic. We did not teach people to abandon commitment. We taught them to examine whether commitment without love is moral simply because it is familiar. And the next, it is about the midlife rebellion disguised as therapy. When heading disrupts profitable suffering, it was labeled rebellion. This criticism came from pseudo experts and institutional gatekeepers. Certain psychologists and religious conservatives and political commentators accuse Aurum Nestle of pathologizing normal aging dissatisfaction. Isn't aging supposed to involve compromise? Or they're medicinalizing ordinary regret? Is this therapy or social engineering? And panels debated whether Aurum Nestle was selling dissatisfaction, and though older adults confronting unlived pain was indulgence. And the next scenario, the politician's speech. A senior cultural minister publicly declared, our civilization survives because the elders sacrifice. If everyone begins pursuing personal happiness at 50, who will preserve moral order? The statement sparked outrage because embedded within it was a naked expectation that older generation exist primarily as support systems, not sovereign beings. Mirror responded at a global summit: sacrifice offered freely in noble, sacrifice extracted through guilt and exploitation. We are not prescribing rebellion, we are legitimizing emotional literacy. And internal documents later leaked showing several corporate elder care industries feared Aurum Nestle because emotionally empowered adults were less likely to enter dependency-based profit system. The accusation of rebellion began to collapse because what critics called rebellion was often simply awakened. And next it is about Armira and Rajiv encouraging emotional divorce. The question was never whether they encouraged separation. The real fear was that they encouraged truth. This because the hardest and most personal attack, emotional divorce, became a buzzword used to suggest that even if people stayed legally married, Aurum Nestle was encouraging psychological independence for loveless spouses, and which in some cases it was not recklessly but ethically, because for many emotional abandonment had preceded legal continuity by decades. The next scenario, the house of appearances. A 60-year-old businessman publicly accused Aurum Nestle of brainwashing his wife after she requested a separate residence. She has everything, he insisted. When intervened privately, his wife answered, yes, everything except conversation. That sentence became a movement anthem. Media attempted to frame Meera as anti-marriage, and yet Aurum Nestle data showed thousands of marriages improved, not ended, because emotional truth was finally addressed. Some couples choose counseling and rekindle intimacy, restructured boundaries, and lived separately but lovingly. Rediscovered friendship. RMNSL was not divorce propaganda, it was anti deception. Rajiv summarized it best. We do not encourage people to leave marriages, we encourage them to leave emotional dishonesty. The cost of public trial, their attacks were not abstract, their children were questioned, their finances audited repeatedly. Former spouses gave selective interviews, and religious leaders condemned them, and memes mocked them. Social media polarized them into saints or sinners. And it is more of the security increased threats. Letters arrived, and investors panicked, and they were insights Mira broke not because criticism was entirely unexpected, but because distortion words wounds differently than truth. One night after a vicious panel discussion, she whispered, Rajiv, what if they make us monsters? Rajiv held her face with extraordinary steadiness. They cannot make monsters of people who built homes for honesty, Mira. Don't worry. The counter revolution of transparency. So they fought not with outrage but with evidence, public adults, resident testimonies and open debates, family reintegration data, and mental health outcomes, independent ethics boards, and perhaps most powerfully, stories. A reunited marriage, a healed widow, a reinvented father, a grandmother who finally wrote a novel, a retired teacher who found love, a son who later thanked Harem Nestle for giving his mother back to herself. A narrative once used against them became their greatest defense. The final shift, eventually, media itself fractured. Some remained hostile. The others began asking harder questions. And what are older people? Why are older people so desperate for reinvention? What failures in family system created this hunger? What does society fear older autonomy? What if Aram Nazal is not the problem but the mirror? And therein lay Mira and Rajiv's true victory. And they were no longer merely defending themselves, they had forced civilization to interrogate itself. Because every accusation ultimately revealed the same hidden fear. What happens if people realize it is never too late to reclaim themselves? The answer society discovered was a revolutionary. They stopped dying before death, and that what was terrified the world most. Television debates dissected them, political panels weaponized them, religious organizations condemned them, social conservatives branded them selfish elites, corrupting cultural endurance. One anchor sneered during a primetime debate. So essentially, Dr. Meera, are you telling parents and spouses to abandon duty because they feel unfulfilled? The nation watched. And Meera did not flinch. Her response became legendary. No, I'm telling them duty without humanity becomes a slavery. We are not teaching abandonment, we are teaching conscious living. A family built by emotional extinction is not morality, it is fear, wearing tradition, silence, then uproar, then applause. Rajiv faced corporate and political threats to sponsors, withdrew, associations pressured him. Certain investors want him to tone down the movement. One powerful businessman told him privately, "You are destabilizing the social order." Rajiv smiled, a dangerous, composed smile, only possible for men no longer ruled by fear. "No," he said calmly, "I am destabilizing profitable misery." And still they continued disciplined, transparent, unyielding. Every accusation became opportunity, every protest increased curiosity, every condemnation proved necessity. Their headquarters expanded into emotional rehabilitation clinics and global online communities, reinvention fellowships, and soul companion forums for ethical companionship. After 50 career relaunch programs, unlived dreams grants, one particularly powerful initiative, Mirror Hour, became internationally transformative. One week, one participant sat before mirrors and answered, "Who did life require me to become, and who am I beneath that?" People broke, healed, and rebuilt. The Aurum Nasal ecosystem, the six pillars of second life transformation. Healing was never enough. They built systems so people could rebuild not merely their hearts but their futures. When Mira and Raju first began, they believed loneliness was the central fatal wound of later life. And they were wrong. Loneliness, they discovered, was often only the symptom. Beneath it was deeper fractures, abandoned ambition, emotional illiteracy, unprocessed grief, romantic starvation, economic irrelevance, and forgotten talent. Social exile dreams differed so long they had nearly fossilized. And so Aram Nazil evolved from sanctuary into infrastructure, not one program, a civilization of second chances. They designed six foundational pillars, each one answering a different cry from the aging soul. The first one, it is about the emotional rehabilitation clinic, the pillar number one. Not all scars are visible. Some are inherited through years of silent endurance. These clinics became the beating heart of Aram Nazil, not psychiatric institutions, not pity centers, not sterile counseling rooms. And they were emotional restoration sanctuaries for those who were 50, carrying and marital emptiness and widowhood and empty nestle grief, betrayal trauma, retirement identity collapse, repressed sexuality, caregiver burdenment, burnout, and lifelong emotional invisibility. Each clinic combines psychology, somatic healing, grief literacy, expressive arts, and community reintegration. The scenario, the woman who forgot her own voice. Shalini, 58, arrived after 32 years of marriage. Her husband had never physically harmed her, he had simply never emotionally known her. I don't know what I like, she confessed during intake. What do you mean? Mira asked gently. Shalini stared blankly. And I know everyone's else tea, performance, preferences. I do not know my own favorite color. The sentence became case study famous for months. Shalini underwent identity reconstruction therapy, mirror sessions, and preference rediscovery exercises, and boundary work and creative experimentation. At 60, she launched a textile design cooperative. Her first public speech began, I came here unable to choose tea. Today I choose my life. The next scenario, the man who never cried. Raghav, 63, a retired military officer, entered after his wife's death, and not because he missed her romantically, but because he realized they had spent 40 years never discussing fear. I protected nations, he told Rajiv. I never learned how to protect my own tenderness. In masculinity rehabilitation circles, he cried publicly for the first time, not for loss alone, for emotional literacy. He later became mentor to other men. The global online communities, geography should never imprison healing. Not everyone could relocate. So Aurum Nestle built digital sanctuaries, secure, moderated, and multilingual platforms where people over 50 from across the world connected through grief forums, reinvention circles, late life divorce groups, and widowhood support, interfaith discussions, creativity labs, ethical companionship channels. No superficial scrolling, only intentional belonging. Live examples, Canada meets Coimbatore, a 67-year-old Indian widow in Toronto joined a women rewriting after loss group. There she met a 62-year-old retired Tamil teacher in Coimbatore. Across continents, they began discussing poetry, aging daughters, regret, freedom. Eventually, they co-founded a bilingual Memayo collective for South Asian women over 60, their first anthology. We were never too late. The next, the reinvention fellowships. Some people do not rescue, they need a sponsorship for the life they postponed. Their fellowship funded structural second life transformations, not clarity, catalytic investment. Residents applied with one question: what would you become if your age and duty were no longer barriers? Selected fellows received housing, mentorship, education, funding, emotional support, global networking. The next scenario, the 61-year-old architect Nazima, once forced into domesticity, had abandoned architecture school at 21. At 60, she applied, I do not want retirement, I want the degree. Grief interrupted. Aram Nazil funded her. At 65, she redesigned trauma sensitive elder house now used internationally. The scenario: the forgotten singer Harbhajan, 71, former shopkeeper, had hidden a magnificent classical voice for decades. His fellowship funded vocal training, digital recording, and touring. Album his debut album, Songs I Was Too Busy Surviving to Sing, went viral. And the Soul Companion forums for ethical companionship after 50. Desire does not expire, it matures, perhaps the most controversial and transformative pillar. This was not dating in the juvenile sense, it was a psychologically guided platform for mature companionship, widows, divorces, ethically separated adults, and never married elders, and intellectual soul seekers. Each participant underwent emotional ethics screening. This was not escapism, it was intentional religious rational design. And the scenario: two lives, one garden. Anjana, 64, a former professor; Farooq, 68, a widower and botanist, and matched not by superficiality but by grief literacy, intellectual compatibility, faith, respect, and emotional values. Their first conversation lasted for 6 hours. Topic: and companionship be holier than marriage? They eventually built an interfaith botanical retreat. The next scenario: chosen friendship. Not all matches were romantic. To Live and Let Live by VMS is a romantic thriller about the second chances. Live and Let Live is a sweeping literary romantic thriller, psychological odyssey, and social revolution that redefines love, aging, freedom, and second chances. At 52, Meera Raman appears to embody everything society reverses: a respected psychologist, devoted wife, accomplished mother, and woman of remarkable endurance. Yet beneath her carefully structured life lies a devastating emptiness. She has spent decades being needed but never truly cherished. Rajiv Dev, 54, is equally imprisoned by success. A powerful strategist, provider, husband, and father, he has built a life of prestige and responsibility, only to realize that respect without emotional intimacy is another form of loneliness. When a chance interaction on social media brings these two strangers together, neither seeks scandal, escape, nor betrayal. They seek only truth, bound by a sacred promise: no photographs, no disruption of family, no false fantasies. They begin an anonymous correspondence rooted in radical honesty through years of infrequent yet profoundly intimate messages. Meera and Rajiv become each other's emotional sanctuary, sharing fears, regrets, dreams, and the painful realization that both have survived life without even truly living it. What begins as faceless companionship deepens into a soul connection so powerful that it challenges every institution built around duty without desire. When they finally meet after years of restraint, their encounter transcends romance and becomes recognition, a spiritual, psychological, and emotional awakening that forces them to confront impossible questions. Can love discovered after 50 be moral? Is choosing oneself as an act of selflessness or survival? Can family remain sacred if selfhood is sacrificed? Is it ever too late to begin again? As Meera and Rajiv choose honesty over performance, they leave behind marriages sustained by appearance, wealth built without intimacy, and social structures that demanded their emotional extinction. But they do not destroy lives, they redefine them. Together, they create second life transitions, a groundbreaking movement dedicated to emotional rehabilitation, reinvention, ethical companionship, and freedom for people over 50 who have been conditioned to make sacrifice for destiny. From emotional rehabilitation clinics and reinvention fellowships to soul companion forums, unlived dreams grants, and the globally transformative Aurum Nestle communities, their private love story becomes an international revolution, yet liberation comes at a cost. Media brands them dangerous, political institutions accuse them of dismantling traditional family values, and religious organizations question their morality. Society places their love, ethics, and mission on public trial, but they both refuse to surrender. Armed with transparency, discipline, compassion, and an unshakable belief that aging is not decline but expansion. They challenge the world's most deeply rooted assumptions about marriage, parenthood, purpose, and the right to live fully. Across the country, like Kyoto, Florence, Kerala, Istanbul, Nairobi, and beyond, they gather global philosophies of healing and transform them into Aurum Nestle, an international movement where older adults can rediscover, reinvent, and companionship, solitude, creativity, healing, romance, purpose, and freedom. What began as one message between two lonely souls becomes a revolution for millions.